In the cafeteria of Jefferson Elementary School in rural Ohio, a 52-year-old white American woman was about to face the fight of her life. What started as serving lunch took a shocking turn when she came face to face with bureaucratic cruelty. Sophie Williams wasn't your typical cafeteria manager. For 15 years, she had quietly fed children from military families in this small town outside Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, known for her fierce protective instincts toward vulnerable students. When she encountered 8-year-old Ethan Carter going without lunch, she had no idea she was walking into a trap. Sophie's choice to feed him with her own money led to her firing a national outrage that would trigger a Pentagon investigation exposing systemic military family failures. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steam from the industrial dishwasher carried the scent of cafeteria soap and something warmer, the kind of care that couldn't be measured in health department regulations. Sophie Williams moved through Jefferson Elementary's kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent the last 15 years turning government-issued ingredients into something resembling love. Her graying blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her fair complexion showed the gentle lines of someone who smiled more than she frowned. Born and raised in small-town Ohio, Sophie carried herself with the quiet strength that came from Midwestern values. Work hard, help your neighbors, and never make a fuss about doing what's right. Her hands worked automatically, portioning out servings of today's lunch: turkey tetrazzini, green beans, and fruit cups, while her mind tracked a different inventory. Emma Rodriguez would need extra crackers. Her father's disability check was late again. The Thompson twins would get double portions without comment. Their mother worked 2 jobs and still struggled to keep food on the table. And Ethan Carter. Sophie's gaze drifted to the clock. He'd be here soon, arriving with that careful dignity 8-year-olds shouldn't have to master. "Mrs. Williams?" Maria, her assistant, appeared at her elbow with a question in her voice. "You want me to set aside the extra portions?" Sophie nodded, keeping her voice low. "The usual ones, and maybe a few extra fruit cups. I bought some with my grocery money yesterday." She didn't mention that her own lunch would be crackers and the apple she'd brought from home. Some economies were too personal to share. Growing up in Fairborn, Ohio, just outside the Air Force Base, Sophie had learned early that military families faced unique challenges. Her own father had served in Vietnam, coming home different in ways that took years for young Sophie to understand. The pride that kept military families strong could also keep them from asking for help when they needed it most. The cafeteria began filling with the controlled chaos of elementary lunch period. Children streamed through the line, some chattering excitedly about playground plans, others moving with the quiet focus of those for whom this meal might be the most reliable one of their day. Sophie smiled at each face, remembering names, asking about tests and lost teeth and weekend adventures. She spotted Ethan before he reached the counter. Even at 8, he moved differently from the other children, shoulders straight, jaw set, as if he were reporting for duty rather than arriving for lunch. His clothes were clean, but showed the telltale signs of careful maintenance. A patch on the knee of his jeans, sleeves that had been let down and rehemmed as he grew. "Hey there, soldier," Sophie said softly as he approached. It was their private joke. He'd told her once that his mom called him that, and Sophie had picked up the habit. "Hi, Mrs. Williams." His voice carried that forced brightness children used when they were trying to be brave. "I don't have lunch money today. Mom said to tell you she'll bring it tomorrow." Sophie's heart clenched. Ashley Carter had been saying tomorrow for 3 weeks now. She knew what pride looked like in a military family, had lived it herself. When her late husband David came back from his second deployment different, wounded in ways that didn't show on his body, That pride could keep you warm on cold nights, but it couldn't fill an empty stomach. David Williams had been her high school sweetheart, a local boy who'd joined the Navy after graduation. Their marriage had been built on shared Midwestern values: faith, family, and service to something bigger than themselves. When David returned from his deployments, Sophie had learned to recognize the invisible wounds that military service could inflict, the way pride and trauma could combine to make asking for help feel impossible. "Well," Sophie said, making a show of checking her clipboard, "it looks like we're testing a new portion size today. Need someone to help me make sure I got it right." She loaded his tray with care: turkey tetrazzini that was mostly turkey, green beans with a pat of butter she'd brought from home, 2 fruit cups instead of 1, and a dinner roll that wasn't technically part of today's menu. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but he played along with the fiction. "Yes, ma'am, I can help with that." "Good man." Sophie handed him the tray, their fingers brushing briefly. His were cold, she noticed, always cold, no matter the weather. Principal Morrison appeared at the kitchen service window just as Ethan walked away. Janet Morrison was a good woman, caught in an impossible position. Sophie had known her for years, watched her work her way up from teacher to principal with the kind of determination that came from believing education could save the world. But Janet also lived in a world of district policies and liability concerns, a world where good intentions had to be documented in triplicate. "Sophie," Janet's voice was carefully neutral, "everything running smoothly?" "Just fine." Sophie continued serving, not meeting the principal's eyes. "Turkey tetrazzini's going over well today." Janet's gaze followed Ethan to his table, where he sat alone, carefully eating his meal in small bites, as if to make it last. "I see. Well, if there are any irregularities in food service protocols, you'll let me know, won't you?" The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Janet knew, had probably known for months. But as long as no one said anything officially, as long as Sophie was careful, as long as the children were fed without creating a paper trail that could bring down district wrath. "Of course," Sophie replied, "always follow protocols." Janet nodded once and moved on, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the sound of someone carrying burdens she couldn't set down. The lunch period continued its familiar rhythm. Sophie served, smiled, and made mental notes. Jamie Peterson had grown another inch. She'd need to adjust his portions upward. The new girl, Sarah, still looked overwhelmed by the cafeteria's noise and chaos. Maybe an extra kind word tomorrow would help. Marcus Walsh had a black eye he was trying to hide, not from hunger, but from troubles at home that were outside Sophie's power to fix with food. When the last child had been served and the last tray cleared, Sophie began her real work. She moved through the kitchen like a general planning a campaign, taking inventory of supplies, checking expiration dates, calculating how many children needed help and how much her own grocery budget could stretch to meet that need. The phone rang at 4:30, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful afternoon. Sophie glanced at Ethan, still working steadily through his homework at a corner table, and reached for the receiver. "Jefferson Elementary Cafeteria, this is Sophie." "Mrs. Williams, this is Patricia from the district office. Superintendent Hayes would like to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow morning regarding some irregularities in food service protocols." Sophie's blood went cold. Her free hand tightened on the edge of the table as she watched Ethan's pencil move across the page, still innocent of the storm that might be gathering. "Irregularities?" She managed to keep her voice steady. "Just some questions about inventory and expenditures. Nothing major, I'm sure. Can you be at the district office at 8 a.m.? Sophie looked around her kitchen, her kingdom of care and quiet rebellion. She looked at Ethan, safe and fed and learning, and felt the fragile world she'd built begin to tremble. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll be there." Sophie's hand remained frozen on the receiver long after the dial tone began its monotone accusation. The district office's fluorescent lights hummed overhead like wasps, and the scent of industrial coffee couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of bureaucratic fear, that particular mixture of cheap carpet, copy machine toner, and the anxiety that came from making decisions about children's lives from behind desks. Superintendent Richard Hayes sat across from her, his fingers steepled in the classic pose of administrative authority. His office walls displayed the usual certificates and photographs, handshakes with politicians, ribbon cuttings, carefully staged shots of him visiting classrooms where every child looked fed and happy. Sophie wondered if he'd ever actually sat in a cafeteria during lunch, watched a child count out pennies and come up short. "Mrs. Williams," Hayes began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who delivered unwelcome news many times before. "I appreciate you coming in this morning. I know this is unusual, but we've encountered some concerns during our routine audit of cafeteria operations." Sophie kept her spine straight, channeling the dignity her late husband David had taught her. The way military families faced bad news. You didn't flinch. You didn't apologize for existing. You listened and planned your response. "What kind of concerns?" Hayes opened a manila folder with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. "Our food service audit shows discrepancies between ordered supplies and documented distributions. Specifically, we're seeing shortfalls in our inventory that don't match the official meal counts." The words hit Sophie like stones. Official meal counts. As if a child's hunger could be quantified in bureaucratic language, reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. She thought of Ethan's careful dignity yesterday afternoon, the way he'd said, "Thank you, ma'am," for help with math homework and a granola bar, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "I see." "Additionally," Hayes continued, consulting his folder like a prosecutor presenting evidence, "we have reports of unauthorized food distribution to students who haven't paid for meals or qualified for the free lunch program through proper channels." There it was, the heart of it. Sophie had known this moment would come eventually, had felt it lurking at the edges of every extra portion, every quietly offered snack. But knowing hadn't made it easier. "Those children were hungry," she said simply. Hayes's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or the weariness of someone who'd learned to armor himself against inconvenient truths. "Mrs. Williams, I understand your compassion, but we have protocols for a reason. Legal liability, budget constraints, federal regulations. If every cafeteria worker decided to freelance our nutrition program based on personal judgment." "Those children were hungry," Sophie repeated, her voice gaining strength. "Ethan Carter hasn't brought lunch money in 3 weeks. His mother is a combat veteran dealing with disability payments that are tied up in bureaucracy. Emma Rodriguez's father is struggling with PTSD and can't work consistent hours. The Thompson twins' mother works 2 jobs and still can't afford—" "Stop." Hayes held up a hand. "This is exactly the problem. You're not a social worker, Mrs. Williams. You're not qualified to make determinations about family need or eligibility. We have proper channels for this. Applications, income verification, federal guidelines." Sophie felt a bitter laugh building in her throat. How long do those applications take to process? How many meals does a child miss while paperwork moves through proper channels? How many times do you think an 8-year-old should have to explain to his friends why he doesn't eat lunch? That's not your decision to make. Hayes's voice hardened. Your job is to serve meals to paying customers and students who qualify for assistance through documented need. Period. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Sophie thought about David, about the way the system had failed him when he came home changed from his deployments. How the proper channels had meant months of waiting for mental health support while he fought invisible battles in their living room. How pride and bureaucracy had conspired to keep help just out of reach until it was too late. "So what happens now?" she asked. Hayes closed the folder with finality. "Effective immediately. You're suspended pending a full investigation into these irregularities. We'll need to determine the extent of unauthorized distributions and assess potential disciplinary action." The walk back to Jefferson Elementary felt surreal, like moving through someone else's nightmare. The security guard, a kind man named Tom, who'd always waved when she arrived early for work, avoided her eyes as he watched her pack family photos and a spare sweater into a cardboard box. Her coffee mug, the one Emma Rodriguez had made in art class with "World's Best Lunch Lady," painted in careful third-grade letters, felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she turned the key in her front door. The cardboard box balanced against her hip like a coffin for 15 years of purpose. The house felt different in the middle of a Tuesday morning. Too quiet, too empty, as if even the walls knew she shouldn't be here at this hour. Her phone buzzed, a text from Maria, her assistant. "Kids asking where you are. What do I tell them?" Sophie started to type, "Tell them I'm sick," then deleted it. She wouldn't begin this with lies, even small ones. "Tell them I'm taking care of something important. Make sure they eat." The phone rang before she could set it down. Unknown local number. "Mrs. Williams, this is Jake Thompson from WOHP News. I understand there's been some kind of situation at Jefferson Elementary regarding the cafeteria program." Sophie's stomach dropped. "How did you—" "I received a call from someone at the school who thought this story deserved attention. I was hoping we could talk. Principal Morrison. It had to be. Janet had found her courage after all, though Sophie wondered if her old friend understood what she'd just set in motion. I don't know if that's a good idea. Mrs. Williams, I've been covering this area for 8 years. I know about military families struggling to make ends meet here around Wright-Patterson. If you were helping children who needed it, people should know about that. They should also know why you were stopped." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. Sophie had expected sensationalism, the kind of journalism that turned human suffering into entertainment. Instead, she heard something that reminded her of David, that particular combination of determination and compassion that came from people who'd seen real problems up close. "Can you meet me at Miller's Diner in an hour?" she asked. "I'll be—" "The woman who looks like she just lost her job for the right reasons." Jake Thompson turned out to be younger than his voice suggested, maybe 35, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time chasing stories than worrying about appearance. He'd ordered coffee, but hadn't touched it, instead focusing entirely on Sophie's words as she laid out 2 years of quiet rebellion disguised as lunch service. "You used your own money?" he asked, making notes in a reporter's notebook that had seen better days. "When needed. David, my late husband, he used to say that some problems don't wait for proper channels." Sophie's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. "He was Navy, served 3 deployments. When he came home, the system wasn't set up to help with what he brought back with him." Jake's pen paused. "Is that why you focused on military families?" "I focused on hungry children. But yes, military families. They face unique challenges. Pride. Mostly, it's hard to ask for help when you've dedicated your life to serving others. And the bureaucracy—" Sophie's voice caught slightly. "David needed help for 18 months before he got it. I watched children needing help for 18 minutes and couldn't stand it." 3 hours later, Jake was knocking on a door in the military housing section of town, a cluster of small apartments that housed families connected to the nearby Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The woman who answered had dark circles under her eyes and moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. Staff Sergeant Carter. I'm Jake Thompson from WOHP News. I was hoping to talk to you about your son Ethan and Jefferson Elementary's cafeteria program. Ashley Carter's face went through a series of emotions. Confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like shame mixed with anger. I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Williams has been helping feed Ethan for several weeks. She was suspended today for violating district policy. The words hit Ashley like a physical blow. She grabbed the doorframe, her knuckles going white. Helping feed? What do you mean helping feed him? Jake realized with growing dismay that Ashley Carter had no idea her son had been receiving extra food, no idea that Sophie Williams had been quietly ensuring Ethan didn't go hungry while Ashley fought her own battles with bureaucracy and pride. "Ma'am, I think we need to talk." By evening, Jake had interviewed 6 military families, 2 school board members, and Superintendent Hayes himself, who'd offered only official statements about policy compliance and proper channels. His story aired at 6 and 11 that night, a carefully balanced piece that presented both Sophie's compassion and the district's policy concerns. But the emphasis was clear. A dedicated cafeteria worker had been fired for feeding hungry children from military families, while bureaucratic procedures left real need unaddressed. The response was immediate. Jake's phone began ringing before the 11 o'clock broadcast ended. Some callers supported the district's position on following proper procedures, but many more, wanted to know how they could help Sophie Williams and the children she'd been feeding. By midnight, a local military spouse named Taylor Brooks had created a Facebook page called Support Sophie Williams and Our Military Families. By morning, it had 300 members and growing. Local businesses were offering donations. Parents were sharing their own stories of economic struggle and the small kindnesses that had made the difference. But the story's transformation, from local news to national phenomenon, began with an unexpected source. 16-year-old Madison Anderson, a military dependent in Columbus whose father was stationed at a different base. Madison had seen Jake Thompson's news story shared on social media, and something about Sophie's situation resonated with her own childhood memories. "When I was 8, Madison wrote in a Facebook post that would eventually reach millions, "My dad was deployed, and my mom worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat while waiting for military pay issues to resolve. I remember sitting in school cafeterias, pretending I wasn't hungry, watching other kids eat while I did homework. I remember the cafeteria worker at my elementary school who noticed, who quietly made sure I had something to eat without making me feel like charity. Her name was Mrs. Rodriguez, and she probably saved my life. Today, Sophie Williams was fired for being that person for other military children. We need to do better." You Sophie Williams. Military families, feed the children. The post included a photo, Madison at 8, gap-toothed and grinning in a military family portrait, her father in dress uniform, her mother holding baby brother with the strained smile of someone holding everything together through sheer will. Below it, another photo, Sophie Williams serving lunch at Jefferson Elementary, captured by Jake Thompson during his interviews, her face showing the natural warmth that had drawn hungry children to her for 15 years. Within hours, Madison's post was being shared across military family networks, veteran organizations, and parent groups. Each share brought new stories. Military spouses talking about food insecurity between deployments, veterans describing the impossible choice between pride and need, teachers sharing observations about children who ate too quickly or fell asleep in class because hunger made concentration impossible. Sophie stared at her phone screen in disbelief. The notification count had stopped updating somewhere around 2,000, the numbers blurring together like digital rainfall. Madison Anderson's social media post was spreading across platforms, with the unstoppable momentum of truth meeting its moment. Her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, She saw Ashley Carter standing on her porch, still in her work uniform, from the overnight shift at the warehouse, holding Ethan's hand. The boy looked smaller than usual, confused by the disruption to his routine. His backpack clutched tight against his chest. Sophie opened the door to find Ashley's eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something else. Shame mixed with gratitude in proportions that made speaking difficult. "Mrs. Williams." Ashley's voice cracked slightly. "I need to. I didn't know. About the lunches? About what you were doing for Ethan?" Sophie knelt to Ethan's eye level, her heart breaking at his serious expression. "Hey there, soldier. How was school today?" "Different," he said quietly. "Mrs. Garcia said you were sick, but Marcus Thompson said his mom heard on TV that you got fired for helping kids like me." The adult conversation, happening over his head, was too complex for 8-year-old understanding. But Ethan possessed the particular wisdom of children who'd learned early that adult problems often had consequences. "For small people, you didn't do anything wrong," Sophie said firmly. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree about the best way to take care of children. But you, Ethan Carter, are exactly right, just as you are." As Madison Anderson's post continued its viral journey, reaching 100,000 shares by evening, Sophie Williams found herself at the center of a national conversation about military family support, institutional compassion, and the cost of following rules that ignored human need. Her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. area code she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Williams, this is Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson. I believe you've been in contact with my daughter Madison. I'm calling from the Pentagon, and I think we need to talk." The black sedan pulled into Sophie's driveway at precisely 800 hours, its government plates and military precision announcing Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson's arrival with the kind of punctuality that made suburban neighbors pause in their morning routines to peer through kitchen windows. Sophie watched from her living room as a tall man in dress blues emerged, adjusting his uniform jacket with the automatic gesture of someone for whom presentation was both armor and identity. She'd spent the sleepless night wondering what Pentagon involvement meant for her small-town rebellion. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's knock was firm but not aggressive, the sound of someone who commanded respect without demanding submission. Sophie opened the door to find herself facing a man whose bearing screamed career military, but whose eyes held something she hadn't expected, uncertainty mixed with what might have been pain. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." His voice carried the crisp authority of military briefings, but underneath she heard something softer, more personal. "I realize this situation is complicated for you. Come in, Colonel Anderson. Coffee's ready." As he entered her modest living room, Sophie noticed him taking in details with the practiced assessment of someone trained to read environments. Quickly, his gaze lingered on the photographs covering her mantle: David in his navy dress uniform, their wedding day, family barbecues where uniformed relatives mingled with civilian friends, the careful documentation of a military family's life. "Your husband served?" he asked, settling into the chair she indicated with a grace that suggested he was more comfortable in formal settings than domestic ones. "3 deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan." Sophie's voice held the particular mixture of pride and grief that military widows carried. "He came home different from the last one. Took 18 months to get him the help he needed. By then." She let the sentence hang, trusting that a career officer would understand the unfinished tragedy. Anderson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry for your loss. And for the system's failure to support him appropriately." The formal condolence felt practiced, but Sophie caught something underneath, a recognition that suggested personal familiarity with military family struggles. "Colonel, can I ask you something directly?" Of course. Are you here to make this go away or to understand why it happened? Anderson studied her for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around the coffee mug with unnecessary precision. 24 hours ago, I would have said my job was damage control, but I spent yesterday evening reading through the social media responses to my daughter's post. I've been reviewing preliminary data about military family food insecurity, and I had a conversation with Madison last night that... He paused, choosing words carefully. That reminded me why I became an officer in the first place. The Jefferson Elementary Gymnasium had never hosted anything like the emergency school board meeting that convened at 7 p.m. on Thursday evening. Folding chairs filled every available space, overflow crowds lined the walls, and local media set up equipment to broadcast what had become the most consequential educational policy meeting in their Ohio county's history. The Pentagon's endorsement had transformed Sophie Williams from fired employee to vindicated advocate, but the school board still held the power to determine whether institutional change would match federal recognition. Principal Morrison arrived early, carrying a folder thick with documentation that represented her own transformation from policy follower to principled leader. The past week had crystallized her understanding that administrative courage sometimes required choosing human need over bureaucratic safety. Board Chair Carol Stevens called the meeting to order with visible nervousness. "Before we begin tonight's discussion," Stevens announced, "I want to acknowledge that this meeting addresses more than personnel decisions. We're examining whether our policies serve our community's children or simply serve our administrative convenience." Taylor Brooks had organized the public comment portion with strategic precision. Ashley Carter spoke with her military bearing evident, her voice steady despite visible emotion. "I spent 20 minutes yesterday explaining to my 8-year-old son why the woman who'd been feeding him was fired for feeding him," she said. "Military children learn early that service requires sacrifice, but they shouldn't learn that needing help makes you a problem to be solved through policy rather than a person deserving dignity." Judge William Mitchell, respected local official and Persian Gulf War veteran, had not been scheduled to speak but requested permission to address the board. "I've spent 30 years balancing legal requirements with community values," he said. "Mrs. Williams' situation presents a question that transcends employment law or education policy. It asks whether we have the moral courage to admit when our rules produce immoral outcomes." The board's discussion revealed deepening divisions, but when the vote was finally called, the result reflected both community pressure and institutional recognition that Sophie Williams had been right about problems they'd preferred to ignore. By a margin of 4-3, the board voted to reinstate Sophie immediately with expanded authority to coordinate military family support programs and community nutrition partnerships. The press conference convened at 1400 hours in the Pentagon's River Entrance briefing room, its formal setting lending gravity to an announcement that would transform Sophie Williams from fired cafeteria worker to unwitting catalyst for military family policy reform. General Patricia Sullivan stood at the podium with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating the intersection of military necessity and human need. 3 days ago, the nation's attention was drawn to Jefferson Elementary School in rural Ohio, where cafeteria manager Sophie Williams was terminated for providing unauthorized food assistance to children from military families. The briefing room fell silent, except for the click of camera shutters, capturing the moment when institutional power acknowledged grassroots truth. "Our investigation, led by Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, has revealed that Mrs. Williams's actions addressed a genuine and widespread problem that our existing support systems failed to identify or remedy. Today, I am announcing a comprehensive Pentagon initiative to address food insecurity among military dependents nationwide. In Ohio, Sophie watched the live stream from her living room. Ashley Carter beside her on the couch while Ethan worked. On homework at the coffee table, the surreal experience of seeing her small-town rebellion become the subject of Pentagon policy announcements felt like watching someone else's life unfold on screen. The Defense Department is immediately implementing the Military Family Emergency Nutrition Program, General Sullivan continued, providing direct food assistance to military families experiencing temporary food insecurity while longer-term support applications are processed. Furthermore, the General continued, we are inviting Mrs. Sophie Williams to serve as a consultant in developing these programs, recognizing that her 15 years of experience identifying and addressing child hunger in military communities represents expertise our policy development requires. Chapter 11. Return to Jefferson Elementary. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Ohio, but inside Jefferson Elementary's cafeteria, the air hummed with something warmer, the anticipation of homecoming mixed with the nervous energy of new beginnings. Sophie Williams stood in the doorway of her kitchen, keys heavy in her hand, looking at familiar equipment and workstations that had been operated by temporary staff during her suspension. Her graying blonde hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for 15 years. But her blue eyes carried new authority. She was no longer sneaking extra portions or using personal funds for unofficial kindness. Maria appeared beside her, beaming with relief that transcended professional courtesy. Mrs. Williams, we saved your apron and your coffee mug, and Emma Rodriguez made you a welcome back card that she's been carrying around for 3 days. The lunch period that began at 11:30 felt ceremonial despite its ordinary appearance. Children moved through the line with familiar efficiency, but Sophie noticed differences. Fewer empty seats, more relaxed conversations, the absence of careful portion management that had characterized hungry students' eating habits. Ethan Carter appeared in line with his usual serious expression, but his posture carried less tension than Sophie remembered. Ashley had shared that the emergency meal programs and community support connections had stabilized their family situation, enough that 8-year-old shoulders could carry 8-year-old concerns instead of adult worries about basic needs. "Hey there, soldier," Sophie said, using their traditional greeting. "How's that math homework coming along?" Better when I'm not thinking about being hungry," Ethan replied, with the matter-of-fact honesty that children possessed before learning to hide difficult truths. "Mom says you're a hero, but I just think you're nice." Sophie handed him his lunch tray, regulation portions served with care that no longer required secrecy. "Being nice is enough, Ethan. Sometimes being nice is everything." Chapter 12. Congressional Testimony. 6 months later, Sophie Williams stood at a podium in the Hart Senate office building, morning sunlight streaming through tall windows as she prepared to address the Senate subcommittee on military personnel. The woman who'd been fired for feeding hungry children now wore the title Senior Consultant for Military Family Nutrition Programs, with the same quiet dignity she'd brought to serving lunch in an elementary school cafeteria. Mrs. Williams, Senator Patricia Hayes began, "Your situation at Jefferson Elementary School exposed gaps in military family support that many of us frankly didn't know existed. Tell us what you've learned in developing the Pentagon's response programs." Sophie consulted her prepared remarks, but spoke from 6 months of experience coordinating between military installations, school districts, and community organizations. "Senator, the most important thing I've learned is that military families face a unique combination of pride and vulnerability. Service members dedicate their lives to protecting others, which makes asking for help feel like personal failure rather than temporary need." Behind her, charts displayed data that quantified what Sophie had understood intuitively. Military families experienced food insecurity at rates higher than comparable civilian populations, often due to deployment cycles, benefit delays, and the geographic isolation of military communities. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, now permanently assigned to lead the Military Family Support Division, provided supporting testimony about program expansion. Since implementation began 6 months ago, Anderson reported, we've established programs at 47 military installations, partnered with 112 school districts, and provided emergency nutrition assistance to over 3,000 military families. The hearing concluded with bipartisan support for expanding funding and broadening program implementation. Senators from both parties praised Sophie's work while committing to legislative action that would formalize and expand military family nutrition support. Epilogue. The legacy continues. That evening, Sophie returned to her small house in Ohio, carrying the weight of congressional recognition, but grounded by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges for military families and new opportunities. To address them, her kitchen table was covered with correspondence from school districts requesting consultation, military family advocates seeking partnership, and thank-you letters from parents whose children had benefited from programs she'd helped design. The most meaningful validation had come that morning in a phone call from Ethan Carter, now 9 years old and thriving in 4th grade. He'd called to tell her about a school project on heroes, where he'd written about Mrs. Williams, who taught me that grown-ups should take care of kids even when it's hard. Sophie Williams had learned that individual moral courage could indeed reshape institutional priorities, that grassroots organizing could pressure systemic change, and that federal authority could validate local compassion. But most importantly, she'd discovered that courage was contagious. When one person chose to act on moral clarity, others found the strength to join them. In cafeterias across the country, children now ate lunch without anxiety, while their military families served with the knowledge that their communities understood the connection between national service and family support. That transformation, Sophie knew, was the real measure of success, not the congressional hearings or Pentagon consultations, but the ordinary miracle of children fed with dignity and families supported with honor. The revolution had succeeded, one lunch tray at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, and tomorrow it would continue. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.